September 1943, somewhere in the Canadian Arctic, latitude 72 degrees. The North Atlantic wind carried more than salt and ice. It carried the sound of war itself, distant, relentless, invisible. Above the frozen waters of the Canadian Arctic archipelago, the sun barely rose now, casting the landscape in perpetual twilight. Massive sheets of pack ice drifted like the wreckage of a forgotten world, grinding against one another with a sound like distant thunder. The temperature had dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius. In these waters, a man in the sea had perhaps 3 minutes before the cold stopped his heart. A ship had slightly longer. This was the graveyard of the Atlantic's northern route. The base sat on a remote promontory of Baffin Island, a collection of wooden structures, reinforced bunkers, and weather-beaten installations that seemed to grow from the rocky terrain itself. The main operations building was partially buried into the hillside, its roof covered in snow that never fully melted. Antenna arrays jutted upward at odd angles, their surfaces coated in ice. Supply crates were stacked haphazardly, their markings long since faded by constant wind and salt spray. The flag that flew from the central post, when the wind wasn't too violent, was Canadian. But the men who worked here knew something the rest of the world did not. Nothing about this place was conventional. Nothing was routine. The guards at the perimeter were Canadian Signals Corps, but inside the fence, scattered among the technical personnel and military engineers, were American observers, British intelligence officers, and men whose nation of origin remained classified. They had been hand-picked. They had signed documents forbidding them from speaking about what they did here, even to their own families. Some of them didn't know the full scope of what they were participating in. Most of them didn't need to. Inside the main operations bunker, beneath layers of rock and reinforced concrete that would withstand a direct hit from a German bomb, though no German bombers had ever reached this far north, sat the machine. It was called the Radar Set Type 271. To the technicians and officers who maintained it, it was something far simpler: salvation. The device was roughly the size of a large cabinet, though its true size was deceptive. Connected to it were cables, transformers, power supplies, and antenna systems that stretched across rooftops and across the tundra itself. Inside, vacuum tubes glowed a faint orange. Needles moved across calibrated dials. A rotating antenna transmitted pulses of electromagnetic radiation into the Arctic sky and sea. Somewhere in that electromagnetic landscape, invisible to the human eye, invisible even to conventional instruments, the machine was looking for ghosts. These ghosts were German U-boats. The Kriegsmarine submarines had transformed the Atlantic into a graveyard in the opening years of the war. Operation Drumbeat, the German assault on Allied shipping, had sunk hundreds of vessels. Freighters, tankers, destroyers, even warships, all fell before the acoustic torpedoes and deck guns of the German undersea fleet. But the Arctic route represented something different. It was the supply line to the Soviet Union. It was the logistical artery that kept the Red Army fighting. Stalin demanded it. Churchill had promised it. Roosevelt had committed to it. Yet every convoy that sailed north from Iceland toward Murmansk was a voyage into a corridor of death. The losses had been catastrophic. In July 1942, convoy PQ-17 had scattered and been hunted into obliteration. 35 merchant ships and 2 destroyers lost. 72,000 tons of war material sent to the bottom. The surviving merchant marine captains refused to sail again. The American sailors spoke of a death sentence. Even the Royal Navy questioned whether the convoys could continue. Yet they had to continue. The alternative was abandonment of the Soviet Union, and that was politically impossible. By 1943, however, something had begun to shift. The flow of intelligence had increased. The scope of German U-boat deployments in Arctic waters was becoming clearer, and a decision had been made at the highest levels of both the Canadian and British military. The Arctic could be contested, but only if the enemy's greatest advantage, invisibility, could be neutralized. The machine in this bunker on Baffin Island was designed for exactly that purpose. The Type 271 radar was not new. It had been in development since 1941, tested on British warships, refined through combat experience. But deploying it to the Arctic presented unique challenges. The cold affected every component. The ice in the air corrupted signals. The magnetic anomalies of high northern latitudes created false echoes. And most critically, secrecy. If the Germans discovered that the Allies could detect their submarines in waters where depth and cold and darkness had always been their sanctuary, the entire tactical picture would shift. The officer commanding this station was Squadron Leader Harold McGregor, a Scottish signals expert who had been chosen for this posting because he had no family, few political connections, and an almost monastic devotion to technical precision. He understood that what happened in this bunker was not about individual heroics or tactical victories. It was about a single, quantifiable outcome. Convoys that sailed north would arrive in Murmansk, and convoys that arrived meant thousands of tons of weapons, ammunition, food, and fuel that would reach the Soviet front lines. Every merchant ship that made the crossing was a small victory in a war where victories were measured in logistics and survival rates. The Germans, for their part, had no idea this station existed. Their submarine commanders operating in Arctic waters still believed they controlled the darkness. They still believed the ice and the cold were their allies. They still believed that when they submerged, they became invisible. This was the assumption upon which their strategy rested. This was the assumption that was about to be violated. October 1943, Baffin Island Operations Center, 0347 hours. The first detection came at 3:47 in the morning. No fanfare, no alarms, just a blip on a cathode ray tube screen, a small, bright point of light that appeared against the circular sweep of the radar display, moving with mechanical precision across the frozen darkness of the Arctic Ocean, 93 kilometers to the northeast of the station. Senior technician James Richardson stared at the trace. His hands were steady, but his breathing had changed. In his 4 months at this station, he had learned to distinguish real contacts from interference, from atmospheric distortion, from the electromagnetic ghosts that haunted every radar screen. This was real. The signature was unmistakable. The movement was too deliberate, too consistent. A target in the water, submerged, traveling at approximately 8 knots on a bearing of 048 degrees. It was a U-boat, detected while beneath the surface. Richardson did not speak. He simply reached for the telephone on the wall beside the console. The handset was bakelite, reinforced military issue. He dialed the extension for the operations officer. 2 rings. 3. The voice that answered was Captain Robert Sinclair, a Canadian naval officer who had been briefed extensively on what the Type 271 could theoretically accomplish, but who had never, in his 6 weeks commanding this facility, actually heard anyone report a confirmed subsurface contact. Ops, we have a possible contact, Captain. Bearing 048, range 93 kilometers, heading north-northwest. The silence on the line was precisely 3 seconds. Are you certain, Richardson? Positive, sir. The signature is clear. Consistent movement. Acoustic shadow analysis confirms submerged target. Another pause. Then, stand by. All other frequencies are being notified. Within minutes, the encrypted signals were moving through classified channels. A consolidated PBY Catalina flying patrol from an airfield on the Labrador coast, approximately 400 kilometers away, received new coordinates. A British minesweeper escorting a convoy of 4 freighters and 2 tankers, total cargo value estimated at £3 million sterling, altered course slightly northward, increasing speed by 2 knots. Anti-submarine frigates positioned themselves forward of the merchant vessels. Depth charges were armed. The crews went to battle stations. What happened next would have been impossible 18 months earlier. The Catalina, operating under radio silence, flew at wave-top level into the Arctic night. Its pilots used dead reckoning and radio direction finding to maintain course. When they reached the approximate coordinates provided by the radar station, they activated their own airborne detection equipment, a Type 24 radar system mounted beneath the aircraft's fuselage. Seconds later, they had independent confirmation. The U-boat's position, course, and speed were now known with sufficient accuracy to make evasion nearly impossible. The submarine's commander, Captain Lieutenant Werner Schaefer, commanding U-701, had no idea he was being observed. The Arctic waters provided depth, darkness, and the acoustic masking of ice noise. According to everything in German naval doctrine, a submerged U-boat in these waters was invisible. The Allies had no sensors, no technology, no capacity to detect a submarine beneath the surface. This had been established operational fact for 3 years of war. Established fact could not account for technological revolution. The Catalina dropped its first pattern of depth charges at Euro 5:21 hours. 8 charges, set for various depths, detonated in a coordinated sequence. The explosions were massive, sending columns of water and fractured ice erupting skyward. The shock waves traveled through the water with lethal force. U-701 had been at a depth of 60 meters when the charges detonated, at 40 meters. The submarine's hull groaned under the pressure differential. Internal alarms sounded. Electrical systems sparked. The crew braced themselves in the darkness as the boat pitched and rolled, damaged but still afloat. Schaefer's response was instinctive. Dive deeper. Increase speed. Run. The submarine descended to 90 meters and began an evasion course, but the Catalina remained overhead, its radar fixed on the U-boat's position. The aircraft dropped another pattern of charges. This time, closer. The reports that began flowing into Canadian, British, and American naval command centers within the next 12 hours established something unprecedented. A submerged U-boat had been detected by land-based radar, tracked with precision, and attacked by coordinated air assets with full knowledge of its position and movement. U-701 survived. Barely. The submarine limped back toward the Greenland coast, its hull compromised, its engines running at reduced efficiency, its crew terrified. Captain Lieutenant Schaefer would file a report describing an aircraft that appeared with uncanny precision, despite complete radio silence and Arctic darkness. The German naval staff would read this report with confusion. Impossible, they would conclude. The Allies' detection capability in these waters should be negligible, yet the data was undeniable. Over the following weeks, more U-boats encountered the same phenomenon. Detection followed by coordinated air attack. A submarine north of Iceland, detected and hunted, its position known with deadly accuracy. Another operating south of Spitsbergen, discovered while submerged and forced to surface in defensive fire from a British trawler converted to anti-submarine duty. The pattern became clear to those analyzing the intelligence reports. The Allies possessed a method of detecting U-boats beneath the surface in Arctic waters. What they did not know, and what remained classified throughout the remainder of the war, was that this detection method originated from a single machine, housed in a bunker on a remote Canadian island, staffed by fewer than 50 personnel, operating under absolute secrecy. The Type 271 radar represented a fundamental inversion of the tactical equation. The U-boat, which had dominated Atlantic warfare through invisibility and technological superiority, was now equally visible to its enemies whether it traveled on the surface or beneath the waves. The darkness that had been its sanctuary became a liability. The depth that had promised safety offered none. In the convoy operations that followed, the casualty rates changed drastically. Where convoy PQ-17 had lost 35 merchant ships in a single operation, subsequent Arctic convoys, protected now by information provided by the radar station at Baffin Island, began to achieve transit success rates of over 90%. Cargoes that were meant for the Soviet front arrived intact, weapons arrived, ammunition arrived, fuel arrived. The Germans, analyzing their losses in Arctic waters, never identified the source. They suspected advanced technology. They suspected improved air-sea coordination. They suspected many things. What they never suspected was that their invisibility had been compromised by a machine they did not know existed, operated by a signals corps in the Arctic, connected to a larger intelligence network that had transformed the hunters into the hunted. November 1943, Kriegsmarine Headquarters, Berlin, Charlottenburg, 14:30 hours. The conference room on the third floor of the Naval Operations Building was precisely 36 meters long, 18 meters wide, and illuminated by recessed ceiling fixtures that cast no shadows. The walls were finished in light oak. Maps covered 3 of the 4 walls: tactical maps, strategic maps, convoy route maps, U-boat deployment maps. On the largest wall, a chart displayed the cumulative tonnage of Allied shipping sunk since January 1939. The number was staggering: 13.7 million tons. Below it, a second number was being updated weekly, sometimes daily. Allied merchant marine losses in Arctic waters, September through November 1943, 32,400 tons across 3 convoy operations. This second number was why Admiral Karl Donitz had called this meeting. The Oberkommando der Marine had begun to recognize a tactical anomaly. U-boat losses in Arctic waters had increased dramatically. 5 submarines sunk or damaged beyond operational capacity in the past 8 weeks. More troubling than the losses themselves was the pattern of the losses. The submarines were being attacked with precision and coordination that suggested advance warning, detection at ranges that should have been impossible, coordinated air and surface attacks arriving within minutes of confirmed contact. Donitz sat at the head of the table. He was 53 years old, with the bearing of a Prussian officer and the tactical mind that had transformed submarine warfare from a peripheral naval operation into a primary instrument of strategic destruction. The data in front of him suggested something he found nearly impossible to accept. The advantage was shifting. To his left sat Capitaine Zurse Hans Gott, the operations officer. In his hands were the operational logs from the past 8 weeks, each entry meticulously recorded by the submarine crews and transmitted back to Germany through secure channels. Gott had spent 20 hours analyzing these logs, correlating dates, times, positions, and circumstances of each U-boat encounter with Allied forces. "The pattern is unmistakable, sir," Gott began, his voice measured but carrying an undercurrent of concern. In previous Arctic operations, this entire year until September, U-boat detection by Allied aircraft occurred at ranges of approximately 12 to 18 kilometers. Visual contact was the primary detection method. Now we are seeing coordinated attacks at ranges where visual acquisition should be impossible. Darkness, blizzard conditions, cloud cover from sea to summit. Yet the attacks persist. Coordinated, precise, lethal. Donitz leaned forward slightly. "You are suggesting what exactly, Capitan?" "I am suggesting, sir, that the Allies possess a detection capability in Arctic waters that we have not previously encountered. Whether it is advanced radar, acoustic detection, or some other technology, I cannot determine. But the tactical effect is clear. Submerged U-boats are being located and attacked with a success rate that indicates knowledge of their exact position." The room remained silent. An admiral, a captain, and 3 staff officers all understanding the implication of what was being stated. Submarine warfare depended on invisibility. If invisibility had been compromised, then the entire operational doctrine required revision. Donitz set down his pencil and folded his hands on the table. "Show me the losses. Specific numbers." Gott opened a folder. Inside were charts, handwritten initially, now being redrawn by the cipher team for official records. The numbers were precise. September 1943, 4 freighters sunk, 1 tanker damaged, 1 armed trawler destroyed. Total tonnage, 19,600 tons. 3 U-boats reported damaged. Estimated crew losses, 87 personnel. October 1943, 2 freighters sunk, 1 motor ship damaged, 1 minesweeper destroyed. Total tonnage, 14,800 tons. 2 U-boats sunk, U-701 and U-956, confirmed through lack of radio contact and signal intelligence intercepts. Estimated crew losses, 156 personnel. November 1943 to date, 1 freighter and 1 tanker sunk, 1 destroyer damaged. Total tonnage, approximately 12,000 tons estimated. 1 U-boat, U-737, reported damaged and possibly sunk. Status unconfirmed. The pattern was economically brutal. In previous Arctic convoy operations, particularly the catastrophic PQ-17, the ratio of merchant vessel losses to U-boat losses had favored the German submarine force by a ratio of approximately 7.1. Here, in the latest operations, that ratio had inverted. For every merchant vessel lost, the U-boat losses were mounting disproportionately. These numbers suggest a fundamental change in operational conditions, one of the staff officers observed. His name was Korvettenkapitän Friedrich Steinhoff. He had served in U-boats, had commanded a patrol boat, and understood the tactical mathematics of submarine warfare intimately. If the Allies can detect our submarines with this precision, the Arctic route becomes not a killing ground for our forces, but a killing ground for us. Donitz did not respond immediately. He rose from his chair and walked to the Arctic convoy map on the wall. Red pins indicated German U-boat positions. Blue pins indicated confirmed Allied convoy positions as of 48 hours prior. Green lines traced the Great Circle routes that the convoys followed from Iceland to Murmansk. Black lines indicated known minefields and ice obstacles. The geography was immutable. The convoys had to travel through Arctic waters. There was no alternative route. The distance from Iceland to Murmansk was approximately 900 kilometers. The journey took 8 to 10 days in good conditions. The water was cold. The ice was treacherous. The weather was unpredictable. These factors had always favored the U-boat, which could wait beneath the surface, hidden and patient, for prey to pass through its killing zone. But if the prey could now see the hunter before the hunter could strike. "How many U-boats do we currently have in Arctic operational sectors?" Donitz asked. 12 assigned to active patrol," Gott replied. 6 in transit to or from operational zones, 3 undergoing repair or refit. "And how many new U-boats are being constructed monthly?" "Approximately 4 to 5, sir." The construction schedule has been increased, but raw materials and labor constraints limit expansion. Donitz turned from the map. His expression had not changed, but something in his posture suggested a calculation was being completed. "Admiral, if I may speak frankly," Steinhoff said, breaking the silence, "the mathematics of this are untenable. We are losing submarines at a rate that cannot be sustained. If we commit more U-boats to Arctic operations expecting to inflict losses on convoy traffic, but we are instead losing submarines more rapidly than we can replace them, then the strategic return is negative. We are spending assets to gain nothing." "Then what do you propose?" Donitz asked coldly. "Reduction of Arctic operations. Redeployment of U-boat forces to Atlantic routes where our tactical advantages remain operational. Accept that the Soviet supply line will flow, but preserve the submarine fleet for operations where it remains effective." Donitz did not answer. Instead, he returned to his chair. On the desk before him lay a classified intelligence report marked "Ultra Secret," a German Admiralty assessment of overall strategic position. The report contained calculations showing that if current losses continued at their present rate, the U-boat fleet would be operationally neutralized within 18 months. Not defeated militarily, neutralized, attritioned into irrelevance. The decision, when it came 3 days later, was transmitted to all U-boat commanders operating in Arctic waters. Arctic operations were to be curtailed. U-boat forces were to be withdrawn from primary convoy attack zones. Patrols would continue, but with reduced intensity and increased operational caution. The strangest element of this strategic decision was that the Germans had no concrete knowledge of what had defeated them. They did not know about Baffin Island. They did not know about squadron leader McGregor and his technicians. They did not know about the Type 271 radar. They only knew the result. Invisibility had been violated, and they did not possess the technical capability to re-establish it. March 1944, Baffin Island Operations Center, dawn. The sun had returned to the Arctic. After months of darkness, the pale light of spring appeared on the horizon for the first time since October, extending its reach a little further each day. The ice was beginning to break apart. The season of continuous Arctic operations was commencing, and the machine on Baffin Island had been running continuously for 6 months, without critical failure. Squadron leader McGregor stood in the observation room, looking out across the tundra toward the frozen ocean. Behind him, the Type 271 radar continued its rotating sweep, the antenna tracing its endless circle against the pale sky. The cathode ray tubes in the operations center glowed with their characteristic orange-green light. Technicians monitored the screens, recording contacts, processing data, coordinating with air and naval assets. The rhythm of the station had become as regular as a heartbeat. In those 6 months, the operational statistics had accumulated into something that resembled not military success, but strategic transformation. Convoy JW-58, which sailed in April 1944 carrying 217,000 tons of supplies to the Soviet Union, lost not a single merchant vessel. In previous years, a convoy of this size would have expected losses of 15 to 25%. The calculations were straightforward. No losses meant no dead merchant mariners. No sunk cargo ships, no weapons or ammunition or food consigned to the ocean floor. By June 1944, the cumulative data was undeniable. Of the 14 major Arctic convoys that had transited north since the Baffin Island radar station became fully operational, the average casualty rate had declined from 18.6% to 3.2%. The Kriegsmarine's own reports, intercepted and decrypted by British intelligence, confirmed the strategic assessment. Arctic U-boat operations had become unsustainable. The submarine force, which had once dominated the Atlantic with technological and tactical superiority, had been forced from the Arctic entirely by October 1943, not through overwhelming military force, not through superior numbers, but through the violation of the one advantage that submarines possessed: invisibility, a single machine, 53 personnel, a remote location, absolute secrecy. These had fundamentally altered the balance of power in Arctic waters, but the impact extended far beyond convoy statistics. In Moscow, Stalin reviewed the shipping manifests of arriving cargo: food, ammunition, fuel, vehicles, weapons. The supplies that had been promised at conferences with Churchill and Roosevelt were now arriving with statistical regularity. The Red Army, fighting the most desperate war in human history against Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front, was no longer facing logistical starvation. The Arctic supply line, the Lend-Lease lifeline, was functioning. The Soviet Union could sustain its war effort. The Eastern Front would not collapse from supply failure. This was not coincidental. This was causation, translated into strategic consequence. In May 1944, 4 weeks before the Normandy invasion, the combined strategic capability of the Allied forces rested partly upon a fact that very few people understood. The Soviet Union had the material capacity to continue fighting because merchant ships were reaching Murmansk. Those merchant ships reached Murmansk because a radar station in the Canadian Arctic had made submarine invisibility obsolete. Dönitz, reviewing the Arctic situation in early 1944, made the strategic decision that the U-boat war in northern waters was lost. Resources were redirected. U-boats were redeployed to Atlantic and North Sea operations where technical advantages remained operational. The Arctic was ceded to the Allies as effectively as if a treaty had been signed, but without negotiation or formal acknowledgement. The Germans simply withdrew, confronted by a technological reality they could neither overcome nor fully understand. The machine remained in operation throughout the remainder of the war. May 1945, Baffin Island Operations Center, 1400 hours. The message came through encrypted channels. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was finished. The date was May 7, 1945. The war had lasted 2,194 days. Squadron leader McGregor received the notification like everyone else on the station. The Type 271 radar was still operational, still rotating, still sweeping the Arctic waters that were, for the first time in 6 years, at peace. The antenna continued its mechanical motion, searching for U-boats that no longer existed in northern waters, that no longer existed anywhere. Over the following days, the station's operational status was transitioned to reduced alert. The technicians began preliminary shutdown procedures. The machine that had changed the Arctic War would not be needed again. Not in this war. But the impact of its existence remained historical fact. Between September 1943 and May 1945, the Baffin Island radar station and the broader Arctic convoy defense network had enabled the successful transit of approximately 4.2 million tons of cargo to the Soviet Union. The casualty rate for merchant vessels had been reduced from the catastrophic 18.25% to less than 5% across the entire operation. Approximately 300 merchant mariners' lives had been saved. Approximately 156 U-boat crewmen had died in Arctic waters. Men who might have survived had the fundamental technological advantage of submarine invisibility not been violated. The strategic consequence was immeasurable. A Soviet Union that had faced potential logistical collapse in 1942-1943 had instead been sustained through the critical years of the Eastern Front War. That sustainability had contributed to Soviet survival. Soviet survival had ensured that Nazi Germany faced a two-front war it could not win. The Arctic convoy machine had been a small component of a vast military apparatus, but components can be critical. The Type that 271 radar would be decommissioned within the year. The station on Baffin Island would be gradually abandoned. The personnel would be reassigned or demobilized. The secrecy would persist. It would take decades before the full story of the Arctic radar stations became known to military historians. The Canadian government maintained official silence. The British intelligence services did not discuss it. The operation receded into historical obscurity, while the war itself became the subject of countless narratives and analyses. I see about sure today. The ruins of that station remain on Baffin Island. The buildings have deteriorated. The antenna arrays have collapsed. The Type 271 radar, that machine which had transformed an invisible war into a visible one, is long since dismantled. No monument marks the location. No plaque commemorates what occurred there. The Arctic wind continues to blow across the same tundra, across the same frozen waters, indifferent to history and sacrifice and strategic consequence. Yet the fact remains, a machine that few knew existed changed the course of Arctic warfare. A technology that the enemy did not understand defeated the enemy's most formidable weapon. Invisibility was violated not through brute force, but through technological innovation and operational secrecy, maintained with absolute discipline. The convoys reached Murmansk. The supplies arrived. The Soviet Union endured. History was altered by invisible means, recorded in classified documents that would not be declassified for decades, understood by fewer than 100 people while the war was still being fought. This is the forgotten machine that kept the Arctic convoys alive. This is the story of how a single technology, deployed in absolute secrecy, altered the course of the Second World War. Thank you for watching. This forgotten operation, buried in declassified archives and military history, represents one of the war's most consequential yet overlooked victories. If this story intrigued you, if you wish to explore more of the hidden operations that changed global conflict, subscribe to this channel. We investigate the classified missions, the secret technologies, and the untold narratives that shaped history. Which secret operation do you believe had the greatest strategic impact on the outcome of the Second World War? Let us know in the comments below. And if you know of other forgotten operations worthy of historical recognition, share them with our community. Thank you for watching. Until next time.